And if hunger isn't a problem of scarcity, and it is a problem of poverty, then we have to ask why we have poverty. And I think that land is central to answering this question: why people are poor, and then why are they hungry. I just want to say that in both 2008 and in 2011, we had record harvests, just to drive home the point. The world had never produced as much food as it did when 1 billion people were going hungry. We also had record profits. The monopolies and the oligopolies which control the global food regime were making record profits at a time when 1 billion people were going hungry. So that's Archer Daniels Midland, that deals in grain, Monsanto, which deals in inputs, Walmart, which is a retailer. All the big retailers, all the big grain merchants, all the big input companies were making record profits, windfall profits, because the price of food was so high, while 1 billion people went hungry. Now, this might seem like it was good news for them, and it was. Everybody wanted a piece of them. All kinds of people bought shares, not in some company, like Cargill is a private company, but in ADM and Dreyfus and whatnot. Everybody wanted shares. And so, of course, the price and the value of the shares in these companies went up. So it wasn't just the profits that they made from the sales of food, but it was because, in the logic of the market, their share price went up as people bought in. But then between 2008 and 2011, the price of food goes down. And so the value of the shares go down because people begin to pull their money out of those stocks. They begin to sell their shares. And so what happens? Suddenly you have these companies who have made trillions of dollars on the food crisis. And now they have an accumulation crisis. They have all this money and nowhere to put it. And they'd better find out quickly because people are pulling their shares out. The price is going down. They've got to reinvest that money. You know, if you're a bank, if you all invest in me, the Bank of Eric, and each one of you puts $10,000 in my bank, I'm happy for about 5 minutes. And then I've got to turn around and invest that money because I have to pay interest to you. Well, the same thing happens with companies. They can't just sit idly by with all this cash. Cash is losing value. Where are they going to put all this money? Well, it turns out they put it in land. Why do they put it in land? They're not the only ones. Insurance companies, our retirement companies, our retirement funds, Goldman Sachs, sovereign wealth funds from other governments. Anybody who's got any disposable cash doesn't want to keep it around where it was going to lose value. And since it doesn't make sense to invest in any productive industries right now because we're in the middle of a global recession, nobody's buying anything, people begin to gobble up land. Well, corporations begin to gobble up land. And some very high net worth individuals as well begin to gobble up land. And so we get what's now referred to as the Great Land Grab. And the Great Land Grab is about 88, I think, million acres worldwide have been grabbed. Now, these grabs are sort of large, very large-scale land deals. Some of them quite shady. And a lot of these happen, you know, sort of in places far away, like Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, anywhere there's land and especially if there's water, right? And so companies come in, make a deal with the government, buy up huge tracts of land, and then the people who are living there have to leave. And very often this is sold as, you know, this is wasteland anyway. There's no one there. Well, that's very rarely the case, that there's no one there. If there was, why would you buy it? Because you wouldn't be able to grow anything on it, right? And all of this land is being grabbed with the same trope that we need to double production by 2050 in order to feed the 10 billion people which we will have by that time? Well, two things. First of all, we already produce enough food today to feed 10 billion people. And two, much of the land that's being grabbed isn't being planted to anything at all. They're just shoving the people off of it. Now, this is happening in the global south, but it's also happening here. It's happening in rural areas, and it's happening in urban areas. And in the global north and in the United States, what's happening, it looks a bit different. People aren't forced off the land here at gunpoint, armed with security guards and whatnot, as they are in the global south. But we have the financialization of land happening here, particularly of our farmland. So what does that mean? So it means that farmers, particularly in the Midwest, but really all over the place, who are getting older and are seeing a tremendously volatile market and have a tremendous amount invested. One has to be so big now just to break even in farming, if you're farming commodities. That means a lot of money up front. That means great big loans, right? And a very volatile market. You can lose your shirt. And if you do that 2 or 3 years in a row, you lose the land. But what's happening is a lot of these farmers are cashing out. Why am I doing this? I'm old. I can get a lot more money on selling the farm than I can ever hope to make growing food or growing fuel or whatever it is we happen to be growing. So farmers are cashing out. The minute they cash out, they can still stay on the land, they can lease it, right? But the value of that land is being pumped up. It's being pumped up worldwide because the value of money is going down, because people want to buy into land, corporations want to buy into land, governments want to buy into land. So the minute the land is bought and it gets into the land market, it becomes a financial asset. And it gets chopped up into little bits and repackaged and sold again, where it gets chopped up again and repackaged and sold again. And so what happens is the value of our farmland has been atomized and is splattered around the world electronically, being traded in milliseconds as we speak, as the price gets inflated and inflated and inflated. So we basically have a land bubble, and it's driven by this terrible crisis of accumulation in which large companies, like the food monopolies, have made massive profits over the last decade, especially during the food crisis. And they have to reinvest these profits. So they're investing it in land. So the price of land is going up. And if you think about it, Bailey talked about sustainability and the time horizon, the farmer's time horizon. So a good farmer, is looking ahead 3 generations. That's how you treat the land, right? As if you were going to live forever. Well, how far ahead do you think Goldman Sachs looks? Seconds. Seconds. That's the time horizon of the financial markets today. So this disjuncture between the way land is traded and the way land needs to be worked is tremendous. And not only is it not sustainable, it's deeply and dangerously inequitable. I think Oxfam produced a report not long ago that indicated that there were 85 individuals that owned half of the world's wealth. That's dropped since the report was published to 80 individuals owning half of the world's wealth. So, that's like almost $2 trillion. I think. Well, this type of inequity leads to profound social and environmental consequences, especially given the land. Right now, the financialization of our farmland is actually relatively low compared to the value of financial markets. It's only about $30 or $40 billion. There's a lot more to be financialized. This is just the beginning. And of course, this happened starting in the 70s with the deregulation of everything and the loss of our public goods. You know, all the privatization and the paring back of government, and pretty soon, you know, this is happening around the world and it's happening here. Just all the functions of health, education, and welfare are being privatized. So if you have money, you can buy them. If you don't have money, you're just out of luck. So these things that are happening, the privatization of our economies, our societies, our governments, right, and the financialization, particularly of land, reveals an even more disturbing trend, which is the erosion of our public sphere. You know, by the time you lose the land, by the time you lose the public goods, by the time they're privatized, by the time people are going hungry, by the time we lose our schools, our public schools, public education services, our public health service and whatnot, we have lost something much deeper, which is the public sphere. And the public sphere is our commons. This is where we come together and we make decisions based on what's right for everybody. Not based on profit. Not based on a quick win. Not based on necessarily what is financially or economically efficient in market terms. But what's good for the environment, what's good for our society, what's good for our community. And so, you know, we see the effects of the loss of the public sphere most painfully in underserved communities of color in particular, where the lack of schools, the lack of public services, the lack of jobs, and the militarization of our police force has led to, you know, the tragic and horrible events of the last 6 months in terms of African Americans being gunned down in their neighborhoods by the police force, murdered. And that we see concentration camps. They're not called concentration camps. They are concentration camps of immigrants in the Southwest. These are the farmers who lost their land as a result of the free trade agreements in the global South and came here looking for work, desperately, crossing a hostile border looking for work. These farmers lost their land. And they pick our crops. They process our food. They cook it. They're in the back of the house of the fanciest restaurants in New York City. And they serve it to us. And yet, these are the people who are the most food insecure in our country. We've done studies on this. The most food insecure people in this country are the ones who work in the food system. Why? Because they're immigrants. And they're people of color. And they're highly vulnerable. The loss of the public sphere at a time like this, when we have 1 billion people going hungry, when we have a rise of violence in the communities, when we have a rise of racism, is crippling. Because it's precisely the public sphere which allows us to deal with these problems, which allows us to come together and say, wait, we can't allow this to happen anymore. What can we do? Let's invest in this way, let's incentivize in the other way, let's provide some programs, let's get the government to provide some scholarships. You know, I went to school on scholarships all the way through. And now when I teach in universities, the students that I teach have, you know, they're $60,000 in debt with a liberal arts degree. European friends look at this and say, those are public schools? So we need our public schools back. But how do we get them back if our public sphere has been eroded? Now, I think that what's clear to me as I travel around the world and meet with different social movements and we study these issues, the one place within the global economy, within all these societies, where the public sphere is being reconstructed is in the food movement. Why? Because you can't transform a food system unless you do reconstruct the public sphere, unless you do establish some form of a commons. You see, our commons are being enclosed, just as they were in the 17th century. Our intellectual commons, our social commons, and the land, through the mechanism I've just described called financialization. So the food movement has many challenges. Right? But I think one of the challenges today in the food movement, which is essential because of the importance of the public sphere, because of the importance of the commons, is land. And it's not just a challenge for the food movement. Land sits at the nexus of multiple crises: the food crisis, the labor crisis, the race crisis, the water crisis, the climate crisis, the financial crisis. Land sits at the center of all these things. So we have to take back our social control over the land. I'll just make some note. I just want to make some very brief remarks on those crises. The labor crisis, of course, the land-labor nexus is a very old one. As I mentioned, starting in the 16th, 17th century, where the commons was enclosed. Why was the commons enclosed? What does that mean? It means the commons was privatized. It was because people depended upon the commons. Villagers depended upon the commons. That's what they call commoners, because they used the commons. They grazed their sheep, they collected firewood, they did all kinds of things. When those were enclosed, when they were fenced off, suddenly the pillar for their existence was removed, and they had to go to work in the factories. So it was quite intentional. Right? That basically has continued. You think about labor in the construction of this nation. Well, first it was slave labor. And it was, in fact, slavery and the tremendous mega profits from cotton, which built Wall Street, which built the banks in New York. That's where the money came from, was from slavery. Indentured servants were brought over because the indigenous people wouldn't work for the colonists. So, of course, they were eliminated. And then waves of immigrants, largely peasants, came to this country and the government gives them access to land. As it takes it away from indigenous people, it gives it to immigrants. But even then, there weren't enough to work the land, so we bring in immigrants just for labor. At one point, in the late 1800s, 7 out of 8 farm workers in this country were Chinese. Now I think over 90% of the farm workers in this country are immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, and they're undocumented and have no rights. And not just no labor rights. They don't have any human rights. This feeds right into the nexus of land and race. Because on one hand, access to land has always been racialized in this country. And for quite some time, it was very difficult for people who weren't white to access land in this country, to be owners. After the Civil War, with abolition, former slaves were able to access land, and they did, by working very, very hard and by working together. And in fact, there was a very brief economic renaissance in the South, where the South began to rise again. Not a white South, a black South. They were the majority in the South. Former slaves were the majority in the South, and they began to work together. And they basically did it through a commons. By working together, they established schools. They ran for office. They ran their communities. And they bought land. Usually bad land, which was cheap. And by 1900, African Americans had managed to acquire, with absolutely no help from the government, because Andrew Jackson made sure that nobody got 40 acres and a mule, they acquired 15 million acres of land. Well, what happened afterwards was completely racialized, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the Jim Crow laws. In spite of all this, African Americans were able to access land until the farm crisis of the 1970s. Now, what happened with the 1970s is that too many people around the world were producing food, and the price of food went down to nothing. So we had a land boom for a while, we had a commodities boom for a while, and then we had a huge crash. So who lost their land first? It's African American farmers, because they were the most vulnerable. They had no protections from the USDA. They had no protections from the government. It's hard for them to get loans. They certainly didn't get their loans forgiven. And tragically and scandalously, white farmers in the national farm organizations of this country stood back and watched it happen. Why? I think there are two reasons. One is just pure racism. These people didn't matter. They weren't good farmers. They shouldn't be in farming. The other was economic interest. These farmers wanted to buy that land, and they did. And so the number of African American farmers was chopped in half. But the cruel joke was on the rest of our farmers, because they were next. And we lost half of our farmers in the United States in the farm crisis of the 1970s. Some of you may remember. Tractorcades on Washington. They were too late. They were too late. Had they stood up and said no when African American farmers began to lose their land, they may not have lost their land. By the time they figured it out, it was too late. So you see, when the commons is lost, and when those who are most negatively impacted by our economic system lose their economic assets, by the time that happens, if we don't do anything about it, it's too late. And so this is why it's tremendously important to step up and not allow these things to happen to our most vulnerable communities. I mean, when we look at how difficult it is now for people in underserved communities of color, we have the highest rates of diet-related diseases, the highest rates of food insecurity, highest levels of poverty. The largest sector of poverty in this country is children of color. They're the poorest people in our country. Well, if we don't stop it there, where does it go next? I think we have an indication when middle-class kids can't afford to pay their loans when they get out of college. The land-water nexus, I think, is obviously critical. So I'm from California. We're experiencing what geologically, or I guess historically, is a mild drought. These things can go on for 50 years. We're into the second or third year now in California. We're falling apart at the seams. So what happens as we're moving into this drought? Harvard University comes to California with the largest endowment in the history of the world and buys up 10,000 acres of rangeland and puts 3,000 of it into grapes. Now, it'd be one thing if they're going from almonds to grapes, because grapes use less water than almonds. No, they're going from rangeland, which doesn't use any water, into grapes, which uses the groundwater. And they did it the night before, basically the night before, we start regulating our groundwater in California. So they grandfather in their access to groundwater, which of course increases the price of their land, of their investment. This is purely speculative. And the reason they do it is because of the water. It's not just the land. It's certainly not just the grapes, though, the grapes are pretty valuable. But the land is even more valuable, and the land is even more valuable because of the water which is underneath of it. So we're seeing water grabs around the world. And I spoke about the land finance and finance nexus, but I'll just say in terms of land and climate change. Because of the fact that, and this has much more to do with land use, of course, but industrial agriculture produces about 20% of the world's greenhouse gases. And it uses up 80% of the world's fresh water. Incredibly inefficient. A terrible way to produce things. And the disproportionate impact of climate change falls the hardest, again, on small farmers, on peasant farmers, on family farmers. Even though they're not the ones producing the greenhouse gases, which of course then drives them to bankruptcy. And the sad part about this is a lot of false solutions out there. The Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, there's a RED Plus program, basically trying to turn the climate crisis into a business opportunity, trying to turn the carbon emissions into a commodity. Well, what does that do? You're encouraging the production of actually more carbon emissions, what it is. So I think what is clear is that we're in a period in which our financial and economics global system is restructuring our access to land, is restructuring our ownership to land, is restructuring the way we use the land. And it's quite regressive restructuring. We call this territorial restructuring in political economy. And it's really about grabbing power, about grabbing land, and grabbing control. And we see this around the world and in the United States as well. And we see it in urban areas. We call it gentrification. Now, people fight back. People push back because their livelihoods are at stake. And the largest land-based organization of resistance is the MST, the Landless Workers Union in Brazil. They've carried out, because in the Constitution of Brazil, there's a clause in the Constitution that says land needs to serve a social purpose. So if the land is idled, and quite a bit of Brazilian land it's owned by large plantations, large haciendas that aren't working the land. So the MST occupies the land. They take people and they occupy the land. Some like 2,500 land occupations over the last 20 years. And then the government has to step in and figure out a deal. And so they'll either buy the land from the landowner and then sell or give it to the MST. There are a certain set of conditions. In a way, they're doing a land trust, but it's a forced land trust. Because this land trust is not, the emphasis is actually not about conservation, as it has been historically with land trusts here. The emphasis is about people, landless people. That's what's driving it. Not necessarily the concern about conserving farmland. It's the concern about we're starving. We need land. And that's what's driving these tremendous occupations. Over 7.5 million acres have been distributed to over 50,000 families. Now the Brazilians and some of the other peasant movements around the world call this land sovereignty. And what they mean is that they have a right. The working people have a right to effective access, use, and control over land. This is a human right as far as these organizations are concerned. And it goes beyond just seeing land as a resource, but considering land as a part of a territory. So we're now in the Berkshires territory. It has a certain territorial logic, certain economic logic, a certain cultural logic, social logic, and a productive logic. Right? And so it's not enough just to think about recovering a parcel of land in isolation from the territorial context when you find that land, from the social structures, and whether or not we have a public sphere which can also ensure that this land is used and as a public good, that the products from that land actually serve the people who live there. This is especially a big problem in urban communities, poor communities, because, for example, they have to leave their community to buy food. So that food dollar leaves the community. We need the food dollar to stay in the community. So it's important that the land dollar stay in the community, but then the products of the land and the way those products are sold and the way those products are consumed make a difference as well. We need to restructure our land-based agriculture, our land-based food system, so the wealth of the agricultural system stays in the community, rather than being spirited off to corporate coffers far away and the 80 people who control half the world's wealth. So land sovereignty actually builds on what's called redistributive land reform, redistributive agrarian reform. It's not just about conserving land, it's really about the redistribution of land as an asset when it's not being used for the social good. Right? I think that with the rise of the land trusts, the agricultural land trusts in this country, and the easements, I see as a very promising development, and I very much applaud this land trust for its work. And the American Farmland Trust and Maine Farmland Trust, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust out where I live, this is all essential. We have to do this. This comes from, however, from a logic of conservation, of conserving agricultural land, because it's being gobbled up by urbanization, suburbanization. But there's another logic which we're not paying attention to, which we see coming from the global south, and we see increasingly here in the global north, which is about people. People need access to land. And which people need access to land? I can't show you a slide, unfortunately, but we did a study in California, and we looked at the distribution of land trusts in California, agricultural land trusts. And they are clustered around the Bay Area. Now, this just happens to be, and they're around the Bay Area and around Los Angeles County. These are the richest places in California and some of the richest places in the world. So land trusts tend to be established where there's money for you to buy the land. But if you look in the Central Valley and you look in the northern part of the state, there are no land trusts because people are poor. Now, there's tons of farmers there. They just happen to be immigrants. And there's a lot of young people coming out of college with a $60,000, $70,000 debt who would really like to farm. They can't afford to. And no one can afford to buy the land. And there are no land trusts for them. So I think there is a redistributive logic in terms of the redistribution of resources and wealth in our country and around the world, which land trusts need to address. Because otherwise, what's going to happen with land trusts is what's happened with the economy. They're going to accrue to those who have the most resources. And the majority who don't have resources aren't going to have access to land. Now, The other thing I want to say about the United States is that the land trusts don't reflect the demographic, our agrarian demographic. And let me just give you a few figures to demonstrate what I mean. 92% of the farmers who already have land are non-Hispanic white farmers. Only 8% are minorities. 88% of these farmers are men. Only 14% are women. 78% have been in operation for 10 years or more. 22% have been in operation for less than 10 years. 48% called farming their primary occupation. 52% had a different primary occupation. And here's the statistic that I think is very interesting. 75% had agricultural sales and government payments of less than $50,000, while only 25% had sales and payments of $50,000 or more. So that means very few farmers are making the big money, and a lot of farmers are not making much money at all and have to take on other jobs. Do you know the fastest growing sector of farmers in this country? Women. Now, this is approaching the global statistic because globally, women produce more than half of the food in the world. Unfortunately, 70% of the world's hungry people are also women, farmers. So even though they feed us, they're the hungriest ones. That's because they don't have enough land. It's not because they don't know how to farm. It's not because they need GMOs. They don't have enough land. You know, this is usually about the time you quote Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to quote somebody else. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. I don't think anybody here would argue with that. Malcolm X. I'd like to invite all of you who I think are doing excellent work. I think this is the good fight. I think protecting land is the good fight. But I'd like you to consider another aspect, another dimension, because I think that there's not going to be enough money to buy enough land to save it in trusts, to address the social needs which we have in this country. Because right now, land trusts are basically a market niche in which we protect land. Very privileged niche. There's about 30 million acres in land trusts in the U.S., farmland trusts. And they've given rise to tremendous things. Farm incubators, co-ops, federations, supported by food policy councils. We have things called food commons and food hubs. And land trusts are an integral part of this and a very important part of this. I don't want to in any way minimize the importance of the work which has already been done. I just want to consider that in and of itself, I'm not sure it's sustainable as a model. Because I'm not sure that as it stands, it's an open access model. I mean, I'm not sure that it has access to many of those who need it. For that to happen, we would have to form some very strong alliances with other people who need land. The people, in large degree, who make our food system work. And the young people who want to farm from all walks of life. And I don't think that this can be done on the basis of the market alone or taking something out of the market alone by buying it. I think we need the government to do this, and the government's not going to do it unless we make the government do it. And the only way that you create that kind of political will is by building a powerful social movement. And we know this from all the great social changes that have been introduced through history. Abolition, the 40-hour week, universal suffrage. This were never given to us by reformists. Yes, reformists signed the papers. Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced the New Deal. It was a tremendous reform. He would never have been able to do that had people not taken to the streets in the 1930s. I think we really need a movement for land justice in this country. And I think that the movement of land trusts can form a critical part of that movement, a pivotal part of that movement. Because if the land trusts swing their allegiance simply to the market and to those who can afford to buy and conserve land, then I'm not sure that we're going to answer the agrarian question of our times. But if you ally with those who are the ones who are most suffering from the current food system and the inequitable access to land, I am sure that with all of your talent and all of your expertise and all of your goodwill, that an alliance like that will find the means and the way to introduce the legislation which will not only conserve farmland, but will repopulate our countryside with farmers. We have more farmers in jail, we have more people in jail today than we have on the land. This is not socially sustainable. I think you're pivotal. I thank you for your work, and I invite you into a much larger and I think much deeper struggle. Thank you.